And welcome. I'm Nina Rowe. I'm a professor of art history here at Fordham, and it is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Katrin Kogman-Appel. The Center for Jewish Studies here at Fordham has been hosting Katrin as a distinguished lecturer for a 2-week residency. And tonight's talk is the final lecture in a series on the theme From Rituals to Illuminations. Now, I want to take a minute at the beginning to thank medieval studies graduate student Alex French for designing the flyer advertising this series, and theology graduate student and intern in Jewish studies Alex Gruber for all his work supporting this series of events. I also thank Siobhan Ferletza for her tireless work as the administrator for Fordham Center for Jewish Studies, and of course Magda Tedder for her dazzling prowess leading the center, making things like Katrin's residency here in New York possible. So about that residence. Katrin has already delivered 2 talks in the series we're calling The Book and the Seder. In last week's lectures, she first shared her research on the way that instructions for orchestrating the Passover Seder, how these instructions were handled before the development of the Haggadah, the self-contained autonomous books giving directions for leading and participating in the ritual meal of Passover. In some instances, there were experts who would go from house to house, orally delivering guidelines, or there were sometimes refresher courses for what to do in the Passover season that could be offered in the synagogue. And in her second talk, Katrin addressed diverse evidence, Geniza fragments, manuscript codices, and early printed books to reveal how the Haggadah as an autonomous book type was developed, and crucially, how and where early printers sought and assessed potential markets for these productions. And so I know we're all excited to hear what Katrin has to say this evening about the illustration cycles in these new standalone Haggadot and the way that the books function within ritual. But before we get on to the main event, I want to tell you a bit about Katrin, because I recognize that there are folks here tonight who were not able to join us for the events last week when I introduced our esteemed guest. So Katrin Kogman-Appel is at the pinnacle of a career that spans several decades of award-winning and widely celebrated research as a leading scholar of medieval Hebrew illuminated manuscripts and their place in the ritual and social lives of medieval Jews. She now holds the Alexander von Humboldt Professorship in Jewish Studies at the University of Munster in Germany. And until 2015, she was professor, vice dean, and holder of the Evelyn Metz Memorial Research Chair at Ben-Gurion University. And she has also held positions in the States as a researcher and lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1990s, and as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in 1993 and 2010. Katrin's achievements as a scholar are way many to enumerate. Suffice it to say that she has authored 5 books investigating Jewish illuminated manuscripts, considering both issues of production and reception. And she has also published scores of articles and essays that have blazed new paths and steered the conversation, not only within the discourse of her studies, but also has had a profound effect on the study of medieval history and culture in broader terms, and particularly her work has made nuanced and significant interventions in the study of the art of the Middle Ages. So now it's time to get on with the main event. Katrin will deliver her talk, The Book and the Seder 3, The Functions of Illustrated Haggadot. Please join me in a round of applause welcoming Katrin Kogman-Appel.
Thank you. I would like express my thanks again to Magda, to Nina, to everybody who was involved in this wonderful weeks. I'm here to stay in New York and share with you my research and to do other things as well. So indeed, I'm very grateful. Okay, so let's start with the word lecture. This is the final one, and I'm excited about to share with you some actually the last part of my project. I'll start out saying that the vast majority of medieval manuscript remained uncolophoned. We don't know who made them, where, when, and for whom. Now, some years ago, Malachi Bet Aryeh addressed the phenomenon of uncolophoned manuscripts and suggested that those were owner-produced. While this assumption is debatable for various reasons, it does, in any case, not make much sense for Haggadot. Especially if they are professionally penned and illustrated, this would mean that actually most, if not all, Haggadot were owned by scribes. And that does not make much sense. Some Haggadot carry colophons that mention a scribe, but no commissioner. And for those, Bet Aryeh suggested more convincingly that they may have been produced for the market, that their makers had certain owner profiles in mind when producing them. So Joel Ben Simeon, whom I already mentioned in several contexts, is an example of such a scribe. Now, the question that I would like to tackle in this session thus concerns the profiles of those owners and the ways they used or may have used their books. And this also goes along actually with the question, what were the intended use that the scribes or the producers had in mind, but I think they pretty much overlap. The main key to come to grips with this question is illustration. Not only the visual language as such, but occasionally also their degree of lavishness and artistic standards. In other words, in most cases, we can approach the owners only by attempting to sketch potential profiles of people. These people may have simply wanted to own a standalone haggadah, or may have needed one for the proper performance of the ritual. All these people would have to have been individuals whose social and cultural circumstances were in accord with the material features of these books. Now, to be sure, none of the owners of standalone Haggadot were of modest means. They all had to be wealthy. Manuscripts were expensive. And in contrast to the traditional search for the social milieus of readers based on primarily quantitative methods in book history, my interest lies in the material features of these Haggadot and what those features contributed to the uses the owners made of them when performing the Seder. Apart from praxeological concerns discussed in the preceding session, the delineation of these uses will also shed some light on the cultural and social profiles of the users I have in mind. Challenging the focus on quantitative methods in the scholarship of the Livre et Société of the Annales School, and considering the reader's reception, Roger Chartier considers the material features of books as well as the circumstances surrounding the act of reading. Reading of the Haggadah, these circumstances were and still are particularly noteworthy. So what did we learn thus far during those recent two sessions? And I'll make this very brief. Actually, Nina has already touched upon this. The material evidence for the existence of written versions of the Haggadah text goes back to the Gaonic period, to an era when Jewish societies began to move from being primarily oral cultures to increasingly more textual ones, which was in a way a formative period for prayer books in their various physical formats. Although at that time the Haggadah generally appeared as part of the regular prayer book, the Cairo Geniza also held a few small Haggadah booklets, and I discussed them last week. However, the fragmentary state of that evidence does not allow for a quantitative assessment of that phenomenon. 13th century European rabbinic sources discussed the scarcity of Sidurim, suggesting that it was only during the 14th century that prayer books started circulating beyond the rabbinic elite, an observation that is clearly supported also by manuscript evidence. Although the standalone Haggadah as a book historical phenomenon first emerged during the manuscript era, only 11% of manuscript Haggadot are in fact individually bound books. The rest, nearly 90%, were part of Sidurim or other genres. In 1596, I also told you, or those of you who have been with us last week, in 1596, a year that the Jewish community of Mantua delivered the first set of book lists to the authorities of the Inquisition, only 20% of the households kept the Haggadah. 9 years later, this number had increased to 32%. Although the numbers changed, it is obvious that by the early 17th century, a majority of Jewish households still approached the Haggadah through the Siddur. However, a Haggadah is not just a Haggadah. And over the centuries, we observe several different types. Small paper booklets in the Geniza, or now in the Geniza, or now in Cambridge, but have been found in the Geniza. Undecorated parchment Haggadot, and some with only modest embellishment, plain printed Haggadot, Haggadot with marginal drawings, Haggadot with fully painted illustrations, Haggadot with piyutim and further services for the whole week, Haggadot with commentaries, some halachic, some exegetical, both in manuscript and in print. And divergences are observable along both textual and material parameters and raise questions about the actual uses of these book types and the profiles of the people who commissioned and owned them. In some cases, these parameters overlap. Now, my focus in this session today will be on two types. We can't cover all of it. First, Haggadot with images that functioned as bookmarks, and I talked a bit about this in the workshop I gave last week, and I shall explain again in a minute what I mean by this definition. And second, Haggadot with extensive illustration cycles that function as some sort of visual ritual guide. I won't be speaking here about the uses and functions of Iberian Passover compendia or their patronage, because I've written about them 20 years ago and I owned one myself. I believe that this genre of Haggadot belonged to court Jews, but court Jews from a scholarly milieu, or at least court Jews were inspired and influenced by the scholarly milieu. So we are here with two types, what I call the bookmark type and the visual guide type, and both are really typical of Italy, of Ashkenaz, and Ashkenazim living in Italy, and then slowly also for Italians. Now let's start here, actually at the end of the story, and not at the beginning. In 1598, a small-sized manuscript Haggadah was produced by Modena. Now kept in Parma, this book includes a lengthy introduction where the scribe, who revealed neither his own nor the name of the recipient of the book, explained that he collected various explanations of customs to please his friend. The text is accompanied by a commentary that often alludes to Kabbalistic wisdom. Thus, the patron and his friend must have been learned individuals who had a specific Kabbalistic interest and enough knowledge to allow for access to relevant writings. On each page, the text is embellished by a decorative frame, often incorporating small ritual illustrations, some accompanied by explanatory caption. That's what this is at the beginning, so this is not really very, hasn't much context, so I bet that's the location of these little illustrations. Interestingly, the scribe also commented about his images in his introduction, and I'm quoting, "And I also drew some small illustrations so that they may be a sign and a reminder, the oath for those who view them." Now, most of these images can indeed best be described as visual bookmarks. Images that relate in one way or another to the text, but lack detail. They seem to have been designed as markers to assist the reader in navigating the text during the Seder and or to enhance the act of commemoration. Some of these references, and I've shown you other examples of this, some of these visual references can be defined as visual puns, literally translating a verbal expression into a visual reference. One example to the left of such puns is the visualization of the Ezekiel quotation, which I mentioned in my workshop, but I didn't quote because I didn't remember the exact wording. And it says as follows: I let you grow like the plants of the field, and you continue to grow up until you attained to womanhood, until your breasts became firm and your hair sprouted. You were still naked and bare. And so we have here these little naked figures here, and those of you who have been at the workshop have seen other examples of this. We also have here such a pan for the mention of the sword in the text of the Haggadah and of Moses' rod, but they are taken out of context. They don't have any narrative context or any other kind of context. They're just there as kind of markers where in the text we are actually are at this very moment. A few biblical episodes are alluded to visually as well, but again, only by concise hints. An example is an image of two small buildings representing Pharaoh's treasure cities. Down here, there's no building scene, there's no Israelites, there's no bondage, there's just the two buildings. Such visual puns and bookmarks appear in illustrated Haggadot dating from the middle of the 15th century on. While the Haggadah from Modena was made for a learned commissioner, most of the Haggadot with such bookmarks were, however, not intended for learned patrons. Let us take a closer look at such signs and reminders, as our scribe defines them, and see how they may have functioned. 3090, around 3090, the so-called Lombard Haggadah, now in the Broginski collection in Zurich, was produced apparently in Milan for use by Ashkenazim, and those who attended the workshop remember that book. As the late Yael Zirlin showed convincingly, its illustrations were commissioned in the workshop of Giovannino di Grassi. In a recent facsimile edition, Silvia Bolatti has elaborated on this observation. So the Lombard Haggadah features a particularly rich assortment of visual bookmarks. Several times we find the figure of a kneeling or standing man with folded hands as a visualization of we cried to God, or God heard our voice, or similar expressions that abound in the Haggadah. But there's no crowd of Israelites or no scenery or no scenario. There's just a man there and so on. Other examples are the mentioned Ezekiel quotation, which here is symbolized by a male figure, but it's still naked, or the image of a man with a mirror to mark the saying, in every generation, a person is obliged to see himself or herself as he or she had gone out of Egypt. This preference for puns, bookmarks, becomes even more apparent as we look at the ritual scenes that are not overly explicit in the visual information they deliver. And you will see that when I show you the other group, then you will actually understand the contrast of how explicit such images can become. But here they're very concise and they're not at all actually informative. Most of them simply show standing, occasionally seated men with goblets of wine, for example. Images that tell the viewer how to prepare for the ritual or how exactly to perform specific acts are rare in the Lombard Haggadah. The book starts with instructions about preparing the unleavened breads, and an adjacent uncolored image shows a man fetching water from a well. Here we see him a bit fading away. Then we have the section, here's the bread of distress. I said this is the actually beginning of the Haggadah itself after all the initial blessings and the first set of ritual acts. So here the main part starts, and it is accompanied by an image of a single seated man showing a bowl. In the bottom margin of the same page, we see a depiction of 4 men gathered at the Seder table. Over and over again, it becomes obvious that these compositions were designed by people who were not familiar with the Jewish rituals. Thus, the Seder table is attended only by men instead of showing full family gatherings. And the bowl held by the single man is empty, which it shouldn't be. Virtually all such Passover baskets or bowls are filled with all sorts of things. And it looks actually like a hand drum rather than a Passover dish. Finally, the Lombard Haggadah is relatively rich in biblical imagery. But again, these are extremely concise references rather than full-fledged biblical compositions. Examples are an image of the Israelites migrating to Egypt, referenced by a single horse-drawn wagon, or more strikingly or more strangely, the Exodus shown as a single man exiting the building, again in a pun-like approach to visualization. All these vignettes were designed to serve as bookmarks rather than as full compositions that communicate a wealth of information. So now what do I actually mean by bookmarks? And I touch upon this again in my workshop, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but for the sake of different audiences, this is what I should do. You recall that I linked the emergence of the standalone Haggadah to the transition of Jewish societies from primarily oral societies to societies that increasingly handled written text. The use of a written text for the Passover ritual, originally meant to be recited from memory, is certainly indicative of this process. The Passover ritual is performed at home. It is very performative, meaning that there are several performative acts for which you have to leave the text, come back to it, and so on. So you recite parts from memory, you go back to the text to read a bit, you do things, all sorts of things, and you have to go back to show around the book, and then you get it back. So you have to navigate. Or the person who uses the book has to navigate the text and does not necessarily read it in one piece. So there's a constant back and forth. We can also imagine that the book was handed over to a participant to do some reading. Navigating the text while constantly going back and forth was crucial, and we could call the Rashei Dvarim in the Machzor Vitri, the different paragraph headings with their enlarged initial words, certainly as a means to help navigating. And so I argue, were also these bookmarks. These images don't have complex contents. They're small, brief, concise. But when you see the image of a man raising a goblet, you know that the formula of wine blessing is adjacent. Now, a comparative look at the Haggadot produced by Joel ben Simeon a few decades later, in the second half of the 15th century, tells us that he worked with similar visualization strategies. We recall that he worked in northern Italy, but occasionally returned to the German lands. In all his Haggadot, he tended to adhere to a plain text-image relationship, illustrating the text at various places in the adjacent margins. Their concise imagery, these illustrations are similar to those in the Lombard Haggadah. and seem to serve primarily as visual bookmarks, even though he never makes any glitches about the ritual. He certainly knew what he was doing. So we find the portrayals of the four questions, of the four sons, the wise and the wicked and the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. We find the rabbinic rabbis. So there we have, that we have the different citations by Tannaitic rabbis. So we have them here. Here we have a drinking scene. Again, one person. Here we have a man with a matzah. There's another man with a maror, and so on. Most of these images illustrate ritual acts, but they never elaborate on instructive elements, and the pictorial communication is kept to a minimum. Visual puns abound. So we have here again the sword, just with a hand, even not with an angel, or again in this very lovely image of a naked woman for the Ezekiel quotation. Biblical scenes are rare, relatively, and appear only where they are specifically mentioned in the text, such as the bondage in Egypt or the plagues. The focus is on the departure from Egypt and the Israelites approaching the Red Sea while being pursued by the Pharaonic army. And here you have a relatively elaborate composition of this whole scenario, but this is not typical actually for biblical scenes that he included in his books. So there's this broad double-page opening, but again, these are relatively rare. Other biblical narratives are visualized in a much concise manner. We have also some preparation scenes. Now, most or several of his Haggadot, they come with a kind of a short tract, halachic tract about how to prepare this and that, how to search for leaven, how to prepare the matzot, sometimes also how to deal with the eruv, and so on. So these, again, as a kind of a bookmark are accompanied usually just by one man who is doing the cleaning and no further details. A man dressed in fashion of early modern Italy, standing in front of a Renaissance-style cupboard, about to search for crumbs. There's no additional visual information and no visualized instructions. As a group, the users of such Haggadot were difficult to classify, and it is most likely that they were from diverse backgrounds. The mentioned anonymous scribe's colophon from late 16th century Modena, labeling the images added on every page, signs and reminders, implied that the owner of the Haggadah was learned, and the commentary included in it indicates Kabbalistic interest. Other users of this kind, of this type of books, were wealthy, well-educated, often scions of scholarly families, but also saw the lavish status symbol. But they also wanted a book that would be handy for use during the Seder. For example, Joel Ben Simeon's London Haggadah, which this is the one. And those who came to the workshop last week also saw the facsimile. It's actually a very lavish and very large size, very respectable, very presentable book. And it was made for Jacob Matthäus of Ulm, the son of Isaac Seligman of Coburg, a well-known banker and rabbi. Jacob, however, did not become a rabbi, but inherited Seligman's business, while his brother, Moses ben Isaac, was an active scholar and a scribe. Jacob certainly had received a solid education, but he was not an active rabbinic scholar. So how about the second category then? Haggadot with extensive image cycles that, as I argue, function not just as a series of markers to aid navigation of the text, but as some sort of visual ritual guide. Some Haggadot show not only concise imagery, but abundant ritual moments, illustrations that can be interpreted as a way to assist the Seder leader in staging the ritual from its beginning to its end. They go beyond the basic function of visual puns and bookmarks and offer detailed and occasionally specific halachic guidance for the performance of the ritual acts. And again, those who came to the workshop have seen this example, and so I'm going to speak again say a few words about it, and then I'm going to share with you some other examples from the 15th century. Ritual theorists speak of effective rituals versus rituals that fail to fulfill their social, religious, or political functions. We talk about political rituals. The Seder ritual is successful if every participant is able to imagine that he or she personally was redeemed from bondage. And that's why we have all these answers and questions and answers, and all these interactive moments, so that actually this process is possible. Position in the performance of the different ceremonial elements is supposed to engender the interest of the participants and to guarantee a successful ritual in the sense ritual theorists talk about. We have seen that no matter the format of a specific book, the text of the Haggadah usually came with ritual instructions interspersed between the sections of the liturgical text. And this is so in the modern Haggadah, and this was so already in the Middle Ages. By the 13th century, when the standalone Haggadah began to emerge, these instructions had become formulaic, albeit not identical from manuscript to manuscript, and a permanent component of the text. Most of these guidelines appear at the beginning, before the section, "Here is the bread of distress." So I have an example for your left, and it says, this part, this, for example, is an instruction part, where we talk about and so on and so on. Or after the Magid, after this long narrative section of the Haggadah, after the blessing of redemption, and before the matzah and the maror are eaten and the meal is consumed. And that you have on the right. That's the second set of ritual acts. The Burns Head Haggadah in the Israel Museum, used around the year 1300, most likely in the Middle Rhine region, is the earliest extant Ashkenazi Haggadah with a full-fledged ritual image site. And it goes into way more detail as far as rituals are concerned than these bookmark type Haggadot. So let's start with the holiday kiddush, the blessing of the first cup of wine, which is accompanied by the image of a table with a couple, the man raising a cup, and a somewhat clumsy little image indicates that he places the goblet on the palm of his hand, as was and still is common in some Ashkenazi households. I don't know if you can make this up, but actually the goblet is really on the palm of his hand. So this is, Tolban Simeon also does this very often, but this is really going into very precise elements of how to perform these things. On the left, a bowl of water and a towel hanging from a bar above the table reminds the viewer that one soon has to ritually wash one's hands. The image, rudimentary as it seems, instructs the viewer to perform the two acts that are relevant at this stage of the ritual: raise the cup and chant the blessing, followed by the ritual washing of hands, and reminds him thus already of the next step. Then we turn the page. It's probably not exactly the next page, but because there's other blessings in between. But then the actual washing takes place. That's what we have shown here. And again, here's the blessing down here. Never mind. It's in this area. Now. Next, we find another instructive section which here, and you have the translation here. Going again into great detail, actually here more than other Haggadot, a little bit more. And it says, then he, the Seder leader, takes the karpas, which is called celery, epia, says the blessing. Then he dips it in charoset, eats from it, and passes it to everyone. Then he takes the middle matzah and breaks it into two halves and puts one of the halves underneath the tablecloth as a reminder of their knitting balls wrapped in their cloaks. From Exodus 12:34. And this is the afikoman. The second half is to be put between the two complete matzot as a reminder of the bread of distress. And then he removes the roasted meat and the roasted egg from the bowl and recites. So again, going into great detail, and so do the images here on the bottom. So here you have the dipping quite in detail, and then an extra image with the breaking of the matzah and putting it underneath the tablecloth. So this is going into way more detail than this one man shows in the Lombard or the Simon Haggadot, just hint at these little at these performative acts. Now the person who purchased and used such a Haggadah as a ritual guide must have been wealthy. This was parchment, this was professionally written, this was illustrated. Certainly was wealthy. He was literate, but not extremely learned. He was not of a rabbinic background. He saw the memory aid and the guidance that the illustration program was able to provide. It's interesting to observe that around the time the Bird's Head Haggadah was designed in the social ambience of the Shum communities began to change. Here we have them. So I'm talking about Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. The Bird's Head Haggadah apparently was produced here or somewhere in this area. So this is really the heart of Ashkenazi scholarship. It used to be the heart of Ashkenazi scholarship, but it was by the 13th century that the rabbinic elite had been dominant for centuries, began to give way to a financial elite. The contemporary, outstanding, and influential Ashkenazi scholars lived elsewhere, in Rothburg, Maram, in Cologne, Pavia, or Nuremberg. These are processes that can be observed from the 1230s on, and it seems that the production of the Bird's Head Haggadah around 1300 fell right into the period when they were well underway. A member of that financial elite may very well have been the owner of the Bird Heads. Now, the most outstanding examples of this approach were produced during the 1460s in Franconia. Here, two almost identical books. And as such, they are, and here you see one of them. And as such, they are actually of the transition from manuscript as unique, individually designed books. Certain book types that seem to have been successful were offered on the market. So this is kind of a pre-print stage, actually. I mean, these were probably produced already after Gutenberg has introduced his printing press. But still, I mean, printed books were not widely around. So this is right and falls into this period when printing emerged and developed. Both these manuscripts, which I mentioned in the first session, feature an unusual abundance of ritual illustrations, but show only a few images that can be defined as mere bookmarks. So we find, for example, the Tanaitic sages, we find the four sons, but we don't find any ritual panslem, for example. All this sword and the rod and all that is not there. It's really about ritual here. The images come with rhymed captions. By the way, this book, which is known as the Second Nuremberg Haggadah, it's now in the private collection of David Sofer. in London. So what further enhances the function of these cycles as ritual tools is the fact that rhymed explanatory captions accompany all these images. And you see, I mean, this is the preparation of matzot in like several, up to 10 little vignettes, and they all come with at least one such rhymed caption, which actually adds further of this instructive element, and sometimes really go into halachic detail. The density of visualized ritual acts gives the impression that the users of the books are guided through every small act and movement of the Seder. The cycle begins with a series of very detailed preparation scenes. First, every single step of the preparation of unleavened bread is shown. And you remember that bone well in the Lombard Haggadah, that was the only marker of that section in the book. So here you have all this entire series, 3 pages with different little scenes, and really every egg. Going to the well, grinding the flour, going to the well and fetch water, preparing the dough, mixing the dough, setting aside the leftover flour, baking. I mean, everything that is really very shown in a very detailed manner. And in addition, we also have these rhymed captions with specific halachic explanation. Now, this series is followed by an opening. It's actually not an opening. It's sides of one page, one folio, showing how to perform the search for leaven. And again, it's, brooming the house and checking the cellar and setting it aside and searching for the last crumbs and performing the blessing and the annulment and so on. And you even go as far as say that you have to keep the leftovers during the night before the actually annulment, so that it will not, the mice won't spread it again, and you have to do the whole job again. So, I mean, this goes into very precise, and this is actually an halachic issue. It's not just for fun, but the Mishnah says that you don't have to do this because this is going too far, but later on halachic sources say no, you actually have to make sure that mice are not carrying your chametz and messing around the whole house again. So this is really very going into much detail, and we go on with the actual ritual performances. A man going to the cellar fetching wine, and then filling the cup, and then and preparing the charoset even before that, preparing the table, and so on. So you see where I'm heading here. We have no less than 3 visual references to the Kiddush. Here, for example, drinking, raising, sitting on the table, and so on. Which is followed on the next page, and I think I showed you this already by the Havdalah. Again, very precisely shown how to perform it. Again, together with the caption, and then we have the family gathered at the table, dipping the vegetables, and so on. Now, interestingly, also, or very interesting, is breaking of the matzah. Shown on the following opening in a small vignette up here, with a man performing that breaking and 3 boys standing in front of him. Their gestures indicating attention and interest. The caption explains, the boys reach out with their hands to receive the afikoman from their father. This small scene complements a full Seder table composition that shows the Seder leader raising the bowl here on the bottom. Caption makes it clear again. One lifts the plate and recites aloud, here is the bread of distress. In the second Nuremberg Haggadah, the instructions for breaking the bread read as follows. Thereafter, he takes the middle matzah and breaks it into 2. One of the halves you should put underneath the tablecloth to be kept as the afikoman. And the other half is to be put back in place between the two other matzot. Now we note that the contents of the bowl here covered. Before the recitation of this section, 3 matzot had been placed in it, as well as 2 prepared dishes, vegetables that have already been consumed, and a small dish with charose. According to Ashkenazi guidelines, the prepared dishes were to be removed at this very moment. One of the halves of the broken matzah was to be placed in the bowl, which was then covered and passed down to the far end of the table. All this to get the participants engaged and the children interested and so on and curious. The Seder leader is shown as exactly that moment, he passes the Seder bowl to his wife, which is then going to pass it further on until it reaches the end of the table. Finally, of course, he's also imaged leaning on his left arm on a large cushion, so the issue of Ms. Subin reclining is also visualized and referenced here. Now, the image of matzah breaking needs to be paired with a picture that appears only later in the Haggadah, the return of the afikoman by the youngsters who had snatched it earlier. This is shown only in one of the 2 Haggadot, the Yehuda Haggadah, and that's what I'm showing you here in the center, and this is the detail, and this is the full page. So we go on in the text to the afikoman, and now they return it. And there is also a caption that actually explains that they are now returning it to their father. Now, this is in fact the earliest reference I know about of this custom, so popular these days. It is not mentioned in any contemporaneous written text. So here, actually, visual reference here is the earliest indication that this has become a custom here, at least in 15th century Franconia. As in other Ashkenazi Haggadot, the section in what ways this night different from all other nights, this is here, is accompanied by an image of pouring the second cup, which is in Ashkenaz, required in Ashkenaz, not in Iberia. And so again, here it says, tells the user explicitly, now you shall pour the wine. After reciting Halachmania. The section bears an explicit didactic function, the questioning, 4 questions, and becomes question and answer. So this has an explicit didactic function, as it actually explains the essence of the ceremony. The didactic aspect of this paragraph is underscored here by yet another image that shows a grown man with a young boy, both portrayed with expressive gestures of speech, here down, that seem to bear a poignantly rhetoric quality. So even this act is actually singled out as a ritual act and shown and visualized. So as you see, going into great detail, and this is not all of it. I'm just showing you a section of, we have a whole second set of ritual acts. And this is going on. And by the way, the same story can be told about the biblical imagery, but I don't have now the time to go into detail here. So I'm asking the question finally, to whom then might such books have been addressed? Uncolophoned, they were likely not commissioned, but meant to be sold on the market. Remember, there were 2 of the kind, maybe more, done like not a mass production, obviously, but multiple production. This is going to be a successful book, and we are going to offer it to more than 1 people. Now, the owner profiles of these books were likely quite similar to that of the Bird's Head Haggadah. Wealthy, literate, not rabbinically learned. So these owners sought the guidance in staging the Passover ritual that the illustration program provided. Except at this time, We find this book not in the famous community of the Rhineland, but apparently in Franconia, perhaps in Nuremberg or another one of the cities that housed Jewish communities. Nuremberg was one of the economic centers of the medieval empire. We have quite a bit of data concerning the demography and the economic situation of it takes it towards the end of my presentation. Let's take a look at this kind of information. And elsewhere in Europe, from the middle of the 13th century on, money lending also emerged in the medieval Holy Roman Empire as the main finance-linked trade among Jews. Commerce remained an important profession as well, but increasingly turned into small trade, often with pawns acquired from money lending. In the 14th century, Jews were still found in a variety of crafts and trades, but these possibilities became more and more limited during the 15th. Among the moneylenders of the later 15th century were a few high-profile bankers, such as the mentioned Jacob Mattathias in Ulm, who commissioned the London Haggadah, as well as his father Seligman dealt in capital sums, huge loans. But most moneylenders handled much smaller funds and gave out small loans. In contrast to the 13th and the 14th centuries, when most large loans went to rulers or the high nobility, during the 15th, one finds fewer nobles among the clients of the Jewish moneylenders. Here we have a map, so I'm talking about these places here. The Rhineland communities are here. We are now here. Here is Würzburg. Here's Nuremberg, where I believe that Nuremberg or probably Bamberg, that these haggadot were produced. And this is Rothenburg. So we have relatively detailed information about the economic standing of members of the Jewish communities in Würzburg and Nuremberg. The data from Würzburg do not offer much demographic insight, but are nevertheless telling with regard to the financial circumstances of the Jews of Franconia. After the Jews were expelled from Würzburg in 1488, 5 moneylenders from the bishopric settled in Rothenburg for several years. The document from 1489, listing the debts owed to these 5 men, reveals that one Mendel of Kitzingen had granted loans amounting to more than 3,070 gulden, the largest amount of capital found in that list. 2 others had advanced loans between 1,000 and 2,000 gulden, while the son and son-in-law of one of them, apparently both very young men, had given loans of altogether 50 and 250 gulden, respectively. These data show that wealth was concentrated in only a few hands and few families. Andreas Weber recently gathered more archival information about Nuremberg from the decades preceding the expulsion of the Jews in 1499. Next to Ulm, Nuremberg was the most important financial center of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1455 and again in 1457, middle of the century, the Council of Nuremberg received loans from several Jews to cover expenses incurred by the armed conflict with the Margrave of Ansbach around 1450. Although the 15th century saw the general economic situation of the Jews of Nuremberg begin to deteriorate, the records show that shortly before the second Nuremberg and the Yehuda Haggadot, these 2 Franconian Haggadot, were produced, several moneylenders were still in a position to grant these loans. The list of the council's Jewish creditors included several scholars and individuals from the rabbinic clans, and others who cannot be associated with the rabbinic elite. Among the rabbinic elite was, for example, the Sack family. Simon Sack had been a rabbi in Nuremberg and head of the yeshiva until his death in 1447. Son, Seligman, also a scholar, acted as Parnas, as head of the community from 1471 until his death, 1497. Sachs' mother Pessel and his stepbrother Meir Yohel was also Parnas from 1464, are also listed as creditors. Another family circled around Jacob Schweinfurt, who died in Nuremberg in 1464, and he was the brother of our friend from Ulm, Seligman of Coburg, the rabbi of Ulm, the father of Jacob Mattathias. Jacob's son-in-law, David Frank, was appointed rabbi in 1451, along with David Sprintz, another rabbi with whom he was involved in several conflicts. Now, people from these circles, I would argue, would either have done without Haggadot or commissioned more lavish ones than these two. They might have wanted, for example, costly status symbols. Well, our two small books, with their quickly executed drawings, fall into another category. And I should mention probably here in parentheses that the lists from Mantua, which I mentioned last week, you can very well see there the collections of rabbis with 150 books, 200 books, 300 books, up to 480 books. The largest of them held 480 books. These people did not necessarily own Haggadot. It was other social circles where we find Haggadot listed among these people among the Jews of Mantua. So people from these circles, I would argue, would either have done without Haggadot or commissioned more lavish ones. However, among the moneylenders who appear as creditors of the city council in 1457 were also several other individuals who seem not to have had any rabbinic connections. The largest loans amounted to 500 gulden, a respectable sum, and it's likely that the owners of the second Nuremberg and the Yehuda Haggadot have to be thought among these people who were wealthy but did not belong to the rabbinic elite. Smaller loans amounted to 100 up to 300 gulden. Now, starting in 1472, the city council of Nuremberg repeatedly discussed the expulsion of the Jews. And in the course of these discussions, the council assessed the number of Jews living in the city. From a document that identified 76 men as the Jewish males in Nuremberg in the spring of 1489, we learn that only 3 out of 15 families, 3 out of 15 households were particularly large, housing 3 generations of men and several servants and other employees such as teachers for the children, altogether between 8 and 11 men in each household, not counting women. Given the overall dire circumstances under which the Jews of Nuremberg lived, the percentage of the poor population was significantly larger than in the preceding decades. So these were few families only, large and wealthy. The leading households in Nuremberg were headed by Moses of Schaffhausen, or also known as Mostel, and the stepbrothers Meir Yohel and Seligman Sachen. And we recall that the latter two belonged to rabbinic families. Now, we shall never know whether Moses of Schaffhausen, when he was not a rabbi, owned any of these 2 books. And I'm not trying to attribute the books to any specific person here, but the archival information available offers some insight into the profile of people like them. For such individuals who were wealthy enough to purchase an illustrated Haggadah were used as a ritual guide, help in conducting a successful Seder ceremony with their large families, their large households. Further, given that they were not part of any scholarly elite, they were apparently in need of such a book. Now, these are but a few examples of Haggadot, whose designers and whose owners must have approached the image cycles found in them as visual guide towards staging a successful ritual and performing the various performative acts at the right moments, in the right order, and following halachic prescriptions. In comparison to the earlier discussed bookmarks, these images are richer in detail especially details that are linked with these performances. Now, I've focused here on Ashkenazi Haggadot because here this phenomenon was more common than in Iberia. I shall conclude with another example now housed in London, additional manuscript 14761, traditionally known in the scholarship as Barcelona Haggadah, and recently discussed also by Baby Purple. It's the only Iberian Passover codex with an extensive ritual imagery. Maybe dates it to the second half of the 14th century, and I believe she's right. It was definitely a book for the wealthy. Its scribal work is of high quality, and a generous amount of parchment was used to create a rich compendium with piyutim and biblical readings for the holiday, both Torah portions and Haftarot. Miniatures composed as initial panels and unframed vignettes in the margins were not only fully painted by professional hands, but decorated with animals, dragons, and hybrids in rich scrollwork. The letters of most of the copious initial panels were done in gold leaf. And note that in the Franconia Haggadah, it was silver and oxidated, and looks pretty bad today, so there was barely any gold used there. In its approach to the ritual, this particular cycle, in fact, draws from David Abudurham's ritual guidebook, and I don't have the time to show you this, but we actually can follow, again, every single ritual step and look what Abudurham has to say. It was composed during the 1340s and meant as a guidebook for broader cycles of the Jewish population. It's not a scholarly halachic compendium, but one that went probably to community rabbis and people of wealth, of course. Judging from the number of copies of these works, it seemed to have been quite successful, Abudurham. Now, I don't have any time to go into any detail here, and I'll only say that this manuscript pursued a similar approach, which, however, never turned into a trend. Thank you very much.